Picture this. October 28, 1944. The Philippine island of Leyte, dense jungle terrain where the American liberation of the Philippines has turned into a grinding war of attrition against Japanese forces who refuse to surrender. Private First Class David Chen, a 20-year-old Marine from San Francisco's Chinatown, crouches in a hastily dug foxhole on the perimeter of a forward observation post. His unit, a reconnaissance squad from the 1st Marine Division, has been holding this position for 3 days, watching for Japanese troop movements through vegetation so thick you can't see 10 feet in any direction. At 18:23 hours, Chen radios in his final situation report. All quiet, no movement detected. At 18:25 hours, the observation post commander tries to contact Chen for clarification on an unclear portion of his report. There's no response. Search parties sent at dawn find the foxhole empty, Chen's equipment still in place, his rifle leaning against the earthen wall, his canteen half full. For 78 years, the jungle will keep its secret, growing over the site until the forest erases all evidence that a young Marine had ever been there. Until 2022, when a typhoon tears through Leyte with unprecedented violence, stripping away decades of accumulated growth and revealing something that should have remained buried forever. David Chen wasn't supposed to be in the Philippines. He'd enlisted in 1942 immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, motivated by a desire to prove his American identity at a time when Japanese Americans were being interned in camps and Chinese Americans faced suspicion by association. His parents, immigrants who'd built a small restaurant in San Francisco, had tried to talk him out of enlisting, but Chen was determined to serve. He'd written to his younger sister Lily every week since boot camp, letters that painted vivid pictures of training, deployment, and eventually combat in the Pacific Theater. His final letter, dated October 25, 1944, arrived in San Francisco in early December. Dear Lily, the jungle here is like nothing I've ever seen. Everything is alive. Everything is moving, and you can never be sure what's vegetation and what might be enemy soldiers. We've been on observation duty for a week, watching an area where intelligence thinks the Japanese are massing for a counterattack. Boring work mostly, sitting in a hole staring at trees that all look the same. But there's something wrong about this place. The locals won't come near it. Our Filipino scout says the area is called Bundok ng Nawalang Kaluluwa, Mountain of Lost Souls. He says people disappear here, have disappeared here for generations, long before the war. I told him that's just superstition, but at night, when the jungle sounds change and the air feels different, I'm not so sure. If anything happens to me, tell Ma and Ba I'm sorry I didn't listen. Tell them I love them. Tell them I tried to make them proud. Lily Chen would carry that letter in her purse for 78 years, reading it so many times the creases wore through the paper and she had to tape it back together. The 1st Marine Division had landed on Leyte on October 20, 1944, as part of General MacArthur's campaign to liberate the Philippines from Japanese occupation. The fighting was brutal, complicated by terrain that favored defense and by Japanese troops who'd been ordered to hold their positions at any cost. Chen's reconnaissance unit had been tasked with monitoring a sector of jungle northeast of Tacloban, watching for signs of Japanese movement that might indicate a planned assault on American positions. The observation post Chen had been assigned to was small, just 4 Marines rotating shifts in pairs, occupying a position on a ridge that provided decent visibility of the valley below. The post had been established on October 25th, and the first 2 days had passed without incident. Chen's partner on the evening shift of October 28th was Corporal James Riley, a veteran of Guadalcanal who'd survived 2 years of Pacific combat. Riley's account, given to investigators after Chen's disappearance, would be the only testimony about what happened that evening. According to Riley, nothing seemed unusual when he and Chen took over the observation post at 1800 hours. They'd settled into their routine, Chen watching the valley through binoculars while Riley monitored their radio and maintained their position log. At approximately 18:20 hours, Chen had commented on the light. "Jimmy, look at how the sun's hitting those trees. Does that look right to you?" Riley had looked and seen nothing unusual, late afternoon sunlight filtering through the canopy the way it always did. But Chen had insisted something was wrong about the way the light moved, the way it seemed to pulse in patterns that didn't match the wind. At 18:23 hours, Chen had made his scheduled radio check-in, reporting all quiet. But immediately after signing off, according to Riley, Chen had stood up in the foxhole, staring at something in the jungle. When Riley asked what he was seeing, Chen had said, "Music. Can't you hear it?" Not sound exactly, but something like music. Patterns in the air. Riley heard nothing. He'd assumed Chen was suffering from heat exhaustion or early stages of malaria, both common in the jungle environment. Then Chen had said something that Riley would remember for the rest of his life. "They're calling me. The ones who were lost before. They want me to join them. They say it's better there. No war, no death. Just the pattern, going on forever." Riley had grabbed Chen's arm, trying to pull him back down into the foxhole, but Chen had shaken him off with surprising strength. "I have to go see. I have to understand." And then Chen had climbed out of the foxhole and walked into the jungle. Riley had immediately radioed for support. But by the time the reaction team arrived 15 minutes later, Chen was gone. They'd found his tracks leading away from the foxhole, heading into dense vegetation with no apparent destination. The tracks continued for approximately 30 meters, then simply stopped in a small clearing where the ground showed no signs of disturbance, no evidence of struggle or ambush. It was as if Chen had walked to that spot and simply ceased to exist. The investigation that followed was thorough but inconclusive. Japanese forces operating in the area were interrogated after their eventual capture or surrender. None reported encountering an American Marine on October 28th. The clearing where Chen's tracks ended was examined by intelligence specialists looking for evidence of booby traps or concealed positions. They found nothing. Local Filipino guerrillas were questioned about the area's history and the name Bundok ng Nawalang Kaluluwa. Their stories were consistent and disturbing. The mountain had been considered dangerous long before the war, possibly for centuries. Local people avoided it, believing that something in the jungle took people who ventured too deep. Not animals, not natural dangers. Something else that the locals described with words that didn't translate well but suggested consciousness, intention, and hunger for human presence. Stories told of farmers who'd entered the jungle to hunt and never returned, their families finding nothing but abandoned equipment and tracks that led nowhere. Of children who'd wandered from villages and vanished, their voices heard calling from the depths of the forest but never found despite extensive searches. The official Marine Corps report filed in December 1944 listed David Chen as missing in action, presumed killed by enemy forces or jungle hazards. His family received the telegram with the standard language that explained nothing and offered no real hope. Chen's name was eventually added to the tablets of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery, one of thousands of servicemen who'd vanished in the Pacific Theater and whose remains were never recovered. But the mystery of Chen's disappearance haunted those who'd been there. Corporal Riley, who survived the war and lived until 2003, never stopped talking about that evening in the jungle. He'd tell anyone who'd listen about Chen's strange behavior, about the music that Chen claimed to hear, about the way Chen had walked into the jungle as if compelled by something beyond his control. Most dismissed Riley's account as combat stress or the confused memories of an aging veteran. But a few who heard his story, particularly anthropologists and folklorists interested in Philippine mythology, noted disturbing similarities to other disappearances reported throughout the island's history. The area where Chen had vanished remained largely inaccessible after the war. The jungle reclaimed what little development had occurred during the conflict, and the local population continued to avoid Bundok ng Nawalang Kaluluwa. Occasionally, hikers or researchers would venture into the area, and occasionally they would report strange experiences. Sounds that resembled music but weren't quite sound. Light that moved in patterns that defied natural explanation. And a sense of being watched by something that existed just beyond perception, pressing against the boundaries of normal reality. Typhoon Mangkhut struck Leyte on November 3, 2022, 78 years and 6 days after David Chen's disappearance. It was one of the most powerful storms to hit the Philippines in decades, with sustained winds exceeding 160 miles per hour and rainfall that triggered catastrophic flooding and landslides. The storm's path took it directly over the area that locals still called Bundok ng Nawalang Kaluluwa, stripping the jungle bare, tearing century-old trees from the ground, and reshaping the landscape with a violence that only nature at its most extreme can achieve. When the storm passed and recovery teams began assessing the damage, a Filipino forest ranger named Miguel Santos was surveying a section of hillside that had been completely denuded of vegetation. The typhoon had scoured the ground down to bare earth and rock, creating a moonscape where dense jungle had existed days before. And in that exposed landscape, Santos found something that made him immediately contact authorities. A foxhole, perfectly preserved, exactly as it would have appeared in 1944, containing equipment that bore United States Marine Corps markings. The Philippine government contacted the American Defense POW/MIA accounting agency within hours. By November 6th, a team of forensic specialists and military historians had arrived on Leyte to investigate. What they found would challenge every assumption about David Chen's disappearance and raise questions that authorities still struggle to answer. The foxhole was intact, its earthen walls reinforced with logs that should have rotted decades ago, but showed minimal decomposition. Chen's M1 Garand rifle leaned against the wall exactly where Corporal Riley had described it. His canteen sat beside it, still half full of water that testing would show was chemically identical to water from 1944, showing none of the contamination or mineral accumulation that should have occurred over 78 years. His helmet hung from a support beam, his pack rested in the corner, and his personal effects, including a photograph of his family and several letters from his sister, were spread across a makeshift shelf carved into the earthen wall. But David Chen himself wasn't there. The foxhole was empty of human remains. No bones, no uniform, no dog tags, just his equipment, arranged as if he'd stepped away for a moment and intended to return. And in the dirt floor of the foxhole, pressed into earth that the typhoon had exposed but not disturbed, was a single set of footprints leading away from the position toward what had been dense jungle but was now bare ground, scoured clean by wind and water. The investigation team followed those footprints across 30 meters of exposed hillside, finding them perfectly preserved in soil that shouldn't show tracks from 78 years ago. The prints led to a small clearing where the ground showed signs of significant geological anomaly. The soil composition was different, showing mineral content and crystalline structures that didn't match the surrounding terrain. And at the exact center of the clearing, arranged in a circle approximately 2 meters in diameter, were objects that defied immediate explanation. They appeared to be stones, but analysis would show they were composed of materials that shouldn't exist in natural formation. Geometric shapes with surfaces that reflected light in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Symbols carved into their surfaces that matched no known language but showed disturbing similarities to markings found at ancient sites across Southeast Asia, sites that predated recorded civilization by thousands of years. And surrounding these stones, arranged as if he'd been conducting some kind of ritual or examination, were pieces of United States Marine Corps equipment, Chen's dog tags, his service weapon holster, his field manual, and most disturbing, his boots, still laced, positioned as if someone had stepped out of them and continued walking barefoot into whatever waited beyond. The forensic team documented everything with growing unease. Because the evidence suggested David Chen hadn't been killed or captured on October 28, 1944. He'd walked to this clearing, encountered something that existed outside conventional understanding, and made a choice. A choice that had consequences that lasted 78 years and left behind evidence that challenged everything the investigators thought they knew about reality, consciousness, and what might wait in places where the boundary between worlds grows thin. The excavation was about to reveal the rest of Chen's story. And what lay beneath the surface of that clearing would prove that some disappearances aren't mysteries to be solved. They're warnings to be heeded. Dr. Maria Santos, lead archaeologist from the University of the Philippines, supervised the excavation of the clearing with extreme caution. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed structures beneath the surface, arrangements of stone and metal that formed patterns recognizable from anthropological research into pre-colonial Philippine sacred sites. But these patterns were older, far older than any known civilization in the region, and they'd been deliberately activated, disturbed from whatever dormant state they'd occupied for millennia on the night of October 28, 1944. The stones arranged in the circle were removed carefully, each one documented and analyzed before being lifted. Beneath them, carved into the bedrock itself, were symbols that matched nothing in Philippine archaeological records. Dr. Santos recognized elements from various ancient writing systems, Sanskrit mixed with Proto-Austronesian, Chinese oracle bone script intersecting with patterns that resembled Mayan glyphs. But the combinations were impossible, suggesting either a common origin that predated all known civilizations or contact between cultures separated by oceans and millennia. More disturbing was what lay at the center of the circle, a depression carved into solid rock, approximately 1 meter deep and perfectly circular, lined with a material that analysis would identify as obsidian, but showing crystalline structures that shouldn't exist in volcanic glass. And within that depression, arranged as if placed there with deliberate care, were objects that told David Chen's final story: his Marine Corps dress uniform, carefully folded, his dog tags arranged in a cross pattern, his field journal opened to the final entry and weighed down with a stone to keep the pages from turning, and most impossibly, a photograph that hadn't existed in 1944, showing David Chen as an old man surrounded by people who appeared to be family members in clothing styles from various decades spanning the 20th and 21st centuries. Dr. Santos picked up the journal with trembling hands and read the final entry, dated October 28, 1944, at 18:30 hours. The handwriting was Chen's, confirmed by comparison with his earlier letters, but the content was impossible. "I've made my choice." Corporal Riley couldn't hear the music, couldn't see what I saw when the light changed. But I could. I can. The threshold opened for me specifically, recognizing something in my consciousness that matched whatever frequency it was tuned to receive. The elders, the ones who built this place thousands of years ago, they understood. They knew that reality isn't singular, that time isn't linear, that consciousness can exist in states we don't have words to describe. The entry continued in language that suggested Chen had experienced something transformative. "They're offering me a choice. Stay here, stay human, stay trapped in linear time where the war continues and death waits at the end of a short life. Or cross over, join the pattern, experience existence from perspectives that transcend individual consciousness. They've shown me what it means. I've seen myself growing old, living a full life, dying surrounded by great-grandchildren I haven't met yet. But I've also seen myself here, always here, existing in this moment forever, part of the pattern that connects past and future, and all the spaces between." What Chen described next challenged every assumption about consciousness and reality. "I'm going to cross over. Not because I'm running from the war, but because I understand now what this place is. It's not a trap, it's a refuge. A way station for consciousness that's ready to transcend individual existence and join something larger. The ones who disappeared here over the centuries, they're not dead. They're alive in ways we can't comprehend from this side of the threshold. They experience time as a landscape rather than a river. They exist in multiple moments simultaneously, and they're calling to me, showing me that I can do the same." The journal's final words were written in a different hand, shakier but still recognizable as Chen's. "If anyone finds this, know that I chose this freely. Tell my family I love them. Tell them I'm not lost. Tell them I'm everywhere and every when, experiencing the life I would have lived and the life I chose to live and all the lives in between. The pattern holds everything. Time is just another direction to move in, and I'm finally free to move. Below the words was a date that made Dr. Santos's blood run cold. November 3, 2022, the day the typhoon had exposed the foxhole. But that was impossible. Chen had vanished in 1944. Yet this entry suggested he'd written in his journal 78 years later, on the very day his foxhole was discovered. Dr. Santos examined the paper closely. The ink was fresh, barely dry. The handwriting showed the tremor of extreme age. And the date was undeniable. Somehow, David Chen had written these final words on the same day that searchers had found his preserved equipment. The photograph found in the depression told an even stranger story. Forensic analysis would confirm it had been taken with technology from the early 2000s, showing Chen as a man in his late 70s, surrounded by what appeared to be 4 generations of family. But the faces in the photograph matched no known relatives. Chen had never married. His line had ended with his disappearance. Yet here was photographic evidence of a family he'd never had, a life he'd never lived, existing in some parallel timeline where he'd made a different choice. The Philippine government classified the discovery immediately, but Dr. Santos had already shared preliminary findings with international colleagues. Within days, comparison studies revealed something that sent shockwaves through archaeological and anthropological communities. The symbols carved into the bedrock beneath the Philippine jungle matched patterns found at sacred sites across the Pacific: Easter Island, Nan Madol in Micronesia, the Solomon Islands, sites separated by thousands of miles of ocean, built by cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other, yet all showing the same geometric arrangements, the same impossible combinations of writing systems, the same evidence of technology that predated known civilization. And all of them, when investigated thoroughly, showed evidence of disappearances. People who'd entered sacred spaces and never returned, leaving behind equipment and personal effects but no bodies. Local legends at every site spoke of thresholds, of doorways that opened at certain times under certain conditions, of choices offered to those who could perceive them. The pattern was global, suggesting either a common origin for human civilization far older than current theories allowed, or contact between ancient cultures facilitated by technology we still don't understand. The American military's investigation into Chen's disappearance took a different approach. They focused on Corporal James Riley's testimony, comparing it to reports from other soldiers who'd witnessed similar phenomena during the war. What they found suggested the threshold events weren't random. They occurred in specific locations during specific time periods, most commonly during wars when young men far from home were psychologically stressed and emotionally vulnerable. The music Riley described Chen hearing matched accounts from soldiers in every major conflict of the 20th century. World War I, trenches in France, the jungles of Vietnam, the deserts of Iraq. Always the same pattern of sound that wasn't quite sound, light that moved wrong, and choices offered to those who could perceive the threshold. Dr. Santos's final report, submitted in April 2023 and immediately classified at the highest levels, concluded with a hypothesis that military and government officials found deeply disturbing. David Chen didn't die on October 28, 1944. He made a choice to exist in a different state of consciousness, one that transcends linear time and individual identity. The evidence suggests he experienced multiple timelines simultaneously, living the life he would have had while also existing in the pattern he joined. The photograph and final journal entry indicate he maintained awareness of both states until his death in the conventional timeline around 2022, at which point he left these artifacts as evidence for us to find. The ethical and philosophical implications were staggering. If Chen's consciousness had truly transcended time and individual existence, what did that mean for concepts of life and death? for identity and continuity of self? And more pressingly, if thresholds existed that allowed human consciousness to escape linear time, what happened to those who crossed over? Were they still human in any meaningful sense? Or had they become something else entirely, existing in states that conventional biology and psychology couldn't begin to comprehend? The families of missing servicemen from every American conflict were never told about the Chen discovery. Official policy remained that soldiers listed as missing in action had died in service, their bodies lost to the chaos of war. But privately, intelligence agencies began compiling lists of disappearances that matched the threshold pattern. Soldiers who'd vanished without trace in specific locations, equipment found with no bodies, reports of music and strange light preceding the disappearances. The numbers were shocking. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of servicemen across multiple wars had potentially crossed thresholds rather than dying in conventional combat. In 2024, Lily Chen received a package from the Philippine government. Inside was her brother's field journal, returned to his family after extensive analysis. She read the final entry, written in handwriting she recognized despite 78 years of separation, and understood that David hadn't been killed in the jungle. He'd made a choice she couldn't fully comprehend. She died 6 months later at age 96, having spent her entire life waiting for a brother who existed in too many timelines to ever truly come home to just one. The clearing in the Philippine jungle was sealed and designated a protected archaeological site. The stones were returned to their positions, the depression in the bedrock was covered, and the area was placed off-limits to civilian access. But local residents still report strange phenomena. Lights moving through the jungle at night, sounds that resemble music but hurt to listen to, and occasionally, very occasionally, voices calling from the forest depths, speaking in languages that mix English with Tagalog with tongues that died before writing was invented. The foxhole where Chen had spent his final hours as a conventional human being was preserved as a memorial, though the true nature of what it represented remained classified. Researchers continue to study the site, trying to understand the threshold technology that existed there long before human civilization. And occasionally, instruments monitoring the area detect anomalies. Brief spikes of energy that suggest the threshold opening momentarily before closing again. Temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic disturbances, sounds recorded on equipment but inaudible to human ears, patterns that analysis suggests might be some form of communication. David Chen made a choice on October 28, 1944, that freed him from linear time but trapped him in existent states we can barely imagine. He experienced the life he would have lived, grew old, had family, died peacefully. But he also joined the pattern, merged with something vast and ancient that existed in the spaces between moments, and in 2022, at the exact moment when a typhoon exposed his foxhole, he left evidence of his dual existence for us to find. His sacrifice, if it can be called that, bought us knowledge. But whether we're wise enough to use that knowledge, whether we can resist the temptation to seek out thresholds and experience what Chen experienced, remains to be seen. Because the pattern still exists, the thresholds still open, and the music still plays in certain places under certain conditions, calling to those who can hear it, offering choices that transcend life and death and individual existence. In a Philippine jungle where 78 years ago a young Marine walked into mystery and became legend, the threshold waits, patient, eternal, ready to offer the same choice to the next person who perceives its presence. The question isn't whether others will hear the music. The question is whether they'll be strong enough to resist its call or curious enough to cross over and join David Chen in the spaces between moments where time becomes just another direction to explore. The war that Chen fought in ended in 1945. But the war to remain human, to resist transcendence, to choose individual existence over merger with something vast and incomprehensible, that war continues. And every disappearance, every unsolved mystery, every soldier who vanishes without trace might be another casualty, or another transcendence, or both simultaneously, existing in states that challenge everything we think we know about consciousness, identity, and what it means to be alive. David Chen's final message was clear. He chose freely. He understood the price, and he paid it willingly, trading individual existence for something he believed was worth the cost. Whether he was right, whether his choice freed him or destroyed him, we may never know. Because the pattern doesn't speak in languages we can understand. It only offers choices, and waits to see which ones we make. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.